Welcome, listeners. You are about to immerse yourself in a thrilling mystery, where every shadow holds a secret, and every clue leads deeper into the unknown. Written and narrated by me, Vincent Gray, exclusively for the Detective Chronicles channel. Prepare for a tale of deception, hidden motives, and a crime that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. Don't forget to subscribe. This is a journey you won't want to miss. Vincent Gray, Sherlock Holmes, The Shadow in the Glass. The fog crept in from the river like a slow, relentless tide, its fingers curling around the sharp corners of the buildings and stretching toward the narrow streets of London. It was the kind of fog that wrapped everything in a soft, oppressive silence. Not a soul stirred as the dim gaslights flickered through the mist, casting elongated shadows against the cobblestones. The world seemed muffled, wrapped in a damp cloak of secrecy, as if the very air was conspiring to keep its secrets hidden. Sherlock Holmes strode along the street, his gait deliberate, each step purposeful. His long coat billowed behind him, the frayed cuffs brushing the hem of his trousers. The dampness in the air seemed to settle around him like a second skin, but he paid it no mind. His keen eyes, sharp as a hawk's, swept over his surroundings, processing every detail with an efficiency that bordered on the unnatural. He was aware of everything, every crack in the sidewalk, every rustle of a distant leaf, every hushed whisper in the fog. But it was the absence of sounds that intrigued him most. There were no distant voices calling out to one another, no clatter of horse-drawn carriages on the road. It was as if the city had fallen asleep, allowing its hidden truths to slumber beneath its quiet exterior. Holmes stopped before the Grand Manor, its silhouette looming like a ghost in the mist. The large iron gates creaked on their hinges, as if reluctant to open, yet they did, allowing him entry to the expansive grounds. He noted the delicate ironwork, the sweeping staircase that led up to the front door, and the faint but unmistakable scent of decay that clung to the walls. The house had an air of quiet opulence, though it was easy to see that the wealth was carefully concealed beneath a veneer of neglect. The place was as much a mystery as the invitation that had led him here. The invitation itself had been a curious thing, unmarked, save for the words scrawled in a hurried hand. Your presence is required. A matter of utmost importance awaits you. No name, no explanation. Just a sense of urgency that had tugged at Holmes's insides, compelling him to respond with the precision of a man accustomed to unraveling the most tangled of webs. Even now, as he approached the heavy oak door, the weight of something unseen pressed against his chest. It was a feeling Holmes could not quite name, but it was familiar nonetheless. It was the feeling of being on the precipice of something momentous, a case he could not yet see, but one that beckoned him with the allure of its enigma. He reached for the doorbell, but before his finger could make contact, the door swung open of its own accord. Standing in the doorway was a man of considerable stature, his grey hair neatly combed and his clothing impeccable. Lord Ashford, Holmes assumed, based on the letter that had been left on his desk just a day earlier. The man's face was a study in politeness, yet there was something in the set of his jaw, something in the way his eyes did not quite meet Holmes's own, that betrayed a hidden tension. "Mr. Holmes," Lord Ashford said, his voice smooth as velvet, yet carrying an undertone of anxiety. "I trust the fog has not caused you too much inconvenience." "No inconvenience at all," Holmes replied, his voice low and steady. He inclined his head slightly, taking in the man's carefully crafted facade. "Though I must admit, I find it odd that a gentleman of your stature would summon me with such urgency and then leave no further explanation in the invitation. You've piqued my curiosity, Lord Ashford." Lord Ashford's lips twitched, though his expression remained unchanged. "Indeed, Mr. Holmes. I had hoped that the mystery itself would be enough to entice you." He stepped aside, allowing Holmes to enter. "Please come in. There are others waiting for you inside." Holmes gave a single nod and stepped over the threshold, his boots making soft echoes in the vast, dimly lit hallway. The scent of polish and wood mixed with something fainter, something earthy, almost musty. The walls were adorned with paintings, dark portraits of men and women whose eyes seemed to follow his every move. They watched him like ghosts of the past, and Holmes could not help but feel a strange sense of being observed by more than just the living. The hallway opened up into a large drawing room, its windows shrouded by heavy curtains that blocked out what little light managed to seep through the fog outside. The room was crowded, with several well-dressed individuals clustered in groups, murmuring to one another in low tones. As Holmes entered, they all fell silent, their eyes turning toward him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Lord Ashford cleared his throat, signalling to the guests. "Mr. Holmes, allow me to introduce you to those who are with us tonight." He gestured first to a woman with dark, flowing hair, seated near the hearth. "This is my wife, Lady Eleanor Ashford." Lady Eleanor looked up, her expression a mix of grace and reserve. She offered a polite smile, though her eyes, deep and dark, betrayed an emotion Holmes could not quite place. Something in the way her gaze lingered on her husband suggested a distance between them, an invisible gulf that Holmes instinctively filed away for later consideration. A man near the window, his thin frame stiff with tension, was introduced next. "Dr. Forsyth, a physician in the area," Lord Ashford said. The doctor's sharp features were drawn tight in what appeared to be perpetual disapproval. His eyes flicked to Holmes only briefly, as though he found the detective's presence a disturbance in his carefully ordered world. Finally, Holmes was introduced to Mrs. White, the housekeeper, a woman of indeterminate age who stood apart from the others. She greeted him with an overly eager, almost mechanical smile, her hands clasped tightly before her. She was the first to avert her gaze, a slight nervousness creeping into her movements. Holmes took in the scene, his mind working at lightning speed. The room was filled with tension, a low hum of discomfort barely hidden beneath the surface. The guests' interactions with one another, the way they shifted in their seats or avoided eye contact, all spoke volumes without a single word being exchanged. Lord Ashford cleared his throat once more. "Please, Mr. Holmes, take a seat. We have much to discuss." Holmes remained standing, his sharp gaze sweeping the room one more time before he replied, "I am listening." The words hung in the air, heavy with anticipation. And in that moment, as the shadows from the flickering fireplace danced across the room, Holmes could feel it, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere. Something was amiss. The mystery he had been invited into was already unfolding, and every person in the room held a secret they were desperate to keep hidden. The warmth of the drawing room contrasted sharply with the chill of the fog outside, yet the atmosphere inside was anything but inviting. Holmes allowed his gaze to wander across the room, settling on each individual in turn. The crackling fire in the hearth cast long shadows over their faces, highlighting the tension that lingered beneath their polished exteriors. Lord Ashford motioned for Holmes to sit, but the detective, with his usual precision, remained standing. He did not need the comfort of a chair to conduct his observations. Instead, he focused on the people gathered before him, studying their faces, their movements, and the subtle shifts in their demeanour as they acknowledged his presence. He was acutely aware of the silence that followed, the weight of their expectations pressing upon him. "Well, Mr. Holmes," Lord Ashford said, his voice carrying an undercurrent of nervousness despite his outward calm. "You've met my wife, Lady Eleanor. This is Dr. Forsyth, as I mentioned earlier." He gestured toward the physician standing near the window, a figure whose cold, clinical air only seemed to heighten the mystery of the evening. "And this is Mrs. White, our long-serving housekeeper." His gesture toward the elderly woman was less effusive than it had been for the others, and Mrs. White responded with a quick, almost apologetic curtsy. Holmes nodded, his sharp eyes flicking to each individual as he took in their features. Lady Eleanor, tall and composed, had the aura of someone accustomed to being admired. But there was something else in the way she held herself, a subtle wariness in her posture, as if she were used to being watched. Dr. Forsyth, on the other hand, was entirely absorbed in his own thoughts, his gaze fixed on the fire as though the flickering flames held some secret only he could discern. Mrs. White, though seemingly the least remarkable, was the most difficult to read. Her hands, clasped tightly in front of her, betrayed a nervousness that contradicted her prim exterior. "It's a pleasure to meet you all," Holmes said, his voice measured. He was careful not to sound overly formal, though there was a certain distance to his tone. He was not here to make friends, but to uncover the truth. "I trust your invitation was not given without cause," he continued, addressing Lord Ashford directly. "What exactly is it that brings us all here this evening?" Lady Eleanor's eyes flicked toward her husband, and Holmes caught the briefest flicker of uncertainty in her gaze. It was enough to confirm that she, too, had no clear answer. Lord Ashford cleared his throat, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the arm of his chair. "Ah, of course. How remiss of me," he said, attempting to steer the conversation in a more favourable direction. "I wanted to bring together a small group of people I trust, those closest to me, for a matter of some importance. I had hoped that we might enjoy a quiet evening together, discussing matters of mutual interest." "But," Holmes interjected, his voice cutting through the vague explanation, "I suspect there is something more pressing at hand. Perhaps the matter you referred to in your invitation." The room seemed to tense, the air thick with a sudden, uncomfortable silence. Lady Eleanor's lips pressed together, her expression shifting subtly as though caught between irritation and something darker, something she was trying hard to suppress. Lord Ashford's gaze flicked nervously to his wife before returning to Holmes. "Yes," he said slowly, his tone measured but strained. "There has been an incident, one that I felt was best addressed with your expertise." "An incident?" Holmes repeated, his mind already turning. "What sort of incident are we speaking of?" For a long moment, Lord Ashford did not answer. The silence stretched, suffocating the conversation before Dr. Forsyth's voice finally broke through, dry and calculated. "It's not a simple matter," he said, his eyes narrowing as he took a step forward. "Lord Ashford has been dealing with certain complications. Health complications, I should say. Nothing that could not be managed, of course, but his condition has worsened over the past few weeks. It's been difficult to maintain a facade of normalcy." Holmes observed Dr. Forsyth with a scrutinizing eye. There was something clinical in his delivery, yet his words hinted at something more, a suggestion that the physician knew far more than he let on. Lady Eleanor shifted in her seat, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup, the action betraying her unease. "It's true," she added quietly, her voice a touch brittle. "Things have been difficult lately." Her eyes flicked to her husband, and Holmes caught the faintest trace of something unspoken between them. A secret, perhaps, one they were both trying to keep buried beneath the surface. Holmes did not press further. His attention shifted to Mrs. White, who had remained silent thus far, her gaze cast downward, avoiding the eyes of everyone in the room. There was something about her that unsettled him, something too eager about her servitude, as though she were trying to present herself as harmless. After a moment of strained silence, Holmes spoke again. "And what is it that you believe requires my particular attention, Lord Ashford?" His voice was calm, but the undertone of impatience was unmistakable. He had no time for pleasantries. Lord Ashford shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his fingers now drumming anxiously against the wooden armrest. He broke off, glancing once more at Lady Eleanor before continuing. "I believe someone is trying to harm me." The words hung in the air, startling in their bluntness. The room seemed to exhale collectively, and even Dr. Forsyth's stoic expression wavered for a moment, though only for an instant. "Harm you?" Holmes repeated, his brow furrowing in concentration. "In what way? And why do you suspect this?" "There have been strange occurrences at the manor," Ashford explained, his voice low but steady. "Items have gone missing, small things at first, then larger things. I'm sure it's not just the stress of my condition. But there are other things. Things I can't explain." His eyes flicked to his wife once more, as though he were searching for some kind of reassurance. "Perhaps I could be of assistance," Holmes offered, his voice cool, yet laced with an unmistakable intensity. "But I'll need to know more. Perhaps you can show me some of these occurrences. What has happened exactly?" A deep sigh escaped from Lady Eleanor's lips as she rose from her seat, her posture graceful yet stiff. "If you'll excuse me, Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice now tinged with something bordering on exhaustion. "I believe it would be best if we showed you the room where these events began, Lord Ashford's study." Holmes gave a slight nod, allowing Lady Eleanor to lead the way. The fire crackled behind them as they moved toward the door, the soft murmur of the other guests drifting into the distance. Holmes, however, was already lost in his thoughts, his mind racing with the implications of Lord Ashford's words. There was more to this than simple paranoia. He could feel it. Something was very wrong in this house, and it would only be a matter of time before he uncovered what. The hallway was dimly lit, its shadowy corners filled with a palpable sense of quiet that only heightened Holmes's awareness. The sound of their footsteps echoed softly in the grand space as Lady Eleanor led him toward Lord Ashford's study, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floorboards. Holmes took in every detail, his eyes scanning the walls, the way the light flickered on the edges of the ornate portraits hanging in long rows. He could almost feel the weight of the history that pressed in from all sides. As they approached the study, Lady Eleanor's composure faltered for the briefest of moments. She hesitated before pushing open the heavy door, as if unsure whether the room beyond would betray its secrets. The door creaked open, revealing a spacious room, its wooden furniture dark and imposing, with bookshelves that seemed to stretch toward the high ceiling, filled with volumes that looked ancient and well-worn. The fire in the hearth was low, casting long shadows that stretched across the walls, adding an eerie, flickering quality to the atmosphere. Lady Eleanor stepped inside, her presence almost ethereal in the dim light. She paused near the fireplace, her gaze fixed on something beyond the flames. Holmes followed her into the room, but his attention was already drawn to a peculiar detail: the large desk at the center of the room, its surface cluttered with papers and books. Yet, it was not the desk itself that caught his eye, but the strange stillness in the air, the unsettling quiet that hung over the room as though it had been suspended in time. "Mr. Holmes," Lady Eleanor's voice broke through his thoughts, soft and laden with an emotion Holmes could not quite place. "This is where it all began." She gestured toward the desk, her hand trembling ever so slightly. "The things that have been happening, the strange occurrences, this room holds the answers." Holmes stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the desk. His eyes lingered on the papers scattered across it, their edges curling ever so slightly, as though they had been hastily left in place. But it was not the disarray that interested him, nor the open books with their dog-eared pages. It was the faint, lingering scent of something metallic in the air, a scent that Holmes had grown too familiar with in his line of work. The scent of blood. A sudden chill washed over him, not from the room's temperature, but from the realization that something was amiss. He turned his attention to the floor, his sharp eyes scanning the edges of the rug beneath the desk. His instinct screamed that something hidden beneath the surface was waiting to be uncovered. And then, there it was, a faint smear of dark, dried blood trailing toward the edge of the room. Lady Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as Holmes crouched down to examine the stain more closely. His mind raced, each calculation falling into place with the precision of a finely tuned clock. It was fresh, too fresh to have been here long. "This," Holmes murmured under his breath, his voice barely a whisper, "is not what it seems." Lady Eleanor remained still, her hands clasped tightly together, as though to anchor herself in a moment of growing disbelief. She had remained calm up until this point, but now there was an edge to her composure, a flicker of fear that was impossible to ignore. Holmes knew then that whatever she had hoped to conceal, whatever she had been protecting, was about to come undone. "Lady Eleanor," he said, his voice taking on an edge of steel, "I need you to tell me what happened here. Why is there blood on the floor?" For a moment, Lady Eleanor said nothing. Her gaze shifted toward the far corner of the room, her lips pressed tightly together. When she spoke again, her voice was strained, as though each word was being forced through a throat constricted with tension. "I didn't think it would come to this," she whispered, almost to herself. "I thought we could keep it hidden, keep it from him. But now I don't know how much longer we can keep pretending." Holmes rose to his feet slowly, never breaking his gaze from her face. He was not one for emotion, but the fear and guilt that seemed to radiate from Lady Eleanor were palpable, and they served to deepen the mystery surrounding her and her husband. "Pretend?" he asked, his brow furrowing. "Pretend at what?" The answer, however, was not immediate. Instead, a muffled noise interrupted their conversation, a faint shuffle of feet from outside the door. Holmes stiffened, his senses immediately on alert. He moved to the door in 2 swift strides, his hand resting lightly on the handle. There was something in the air now, a heightened tension that threatened to break at any moment. He opened the door just as a figure entered, stepping into the room with a certain urgency. Dr. Forsyth stood in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of alarm and confusion. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he cast a glance at Lady Eleanor, his expression unreadable. "I thought I heard voices," Dr. Forsyth said, his voice low, his tone as flat as always. But there was something unnerving in his presence. It felt as though he had been waiting for this moment, this particular scene to unfold. Holmes didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Dr. Forsyth," he began, his tone firm. "You'll want to see this." The physician's gaze flicked to the blood on the floor, then to the faint, almost imperceptible stains that marred the edge of the desk. His eyes narrowed, his expression hardening into something that Holmes could not easily decipher. "What is this?" Dr. Forsyth asked, his voice devoid of emotion, but his posture betraying his growing discomfort. This isn't possible." But Holmes was already moving past him, his mind working quickly to form a theory, a hypothesis that might explain the events leading up to this moment. He approached the bookshelf, his fingers grazing the spines of the books as he glanced over the titles, searching for any clue that might shed light on the situation. Lady Eleanor followed him, her eyes flicking nervously between him and the physician. "We didn't want this," she repeated, her voice shaking. "It was supposed to be just a simple mistake, a minor injury." Holmes stopped in his tracks, his head snapping toward her. "A minor injury?" he echoed. "Are you suggesting this was an accident?" For a moment, Lady Eleanor didn't respond. Her lips parted, but no words came out. And then, in a single whispered confession, she uttered the truth that had been hovering just beneath the surface. "He's dead, Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice barely audible. "Lord Ashford is dead." Holmes stood perfectly still, processing the gravity of Lady Eleanor's words. The room, once filled with the faint echoes of whispered conversations, now seemed to hold its breath. The crackling fire, its flames dancing wildly in the hearth, cast long shadows that stretched unnaturally across the walls, adding to the room's oppressive atmosphere. "He's dead," Lady Eleanor repeated, her voice trembling. Her hands were pressed tightly together in front of her, knuckles white. She was no longer the composed, elegant figure she had been just moments ago. Now, she seemed fragile, as though the weight of her confession had cracked the facade she had so carefully maintained. Holmes's mind raced. His eyes flicked between Lady Eleanor, Dr. Forsyth, and the surrounding room, each detail falling into place with eerie precision. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, but his focus remained razor-sharp. There were no obvious signs of foul play, no blood staining the carpets. Nothing, it seemed, had been disturbed in the way one might expect after a violent act. Yet the evidence in front of him told a different story. "Where is his body?" Holmes asked, his voice a low murmur, cutting through the silence like a knife. Lady Eleanor glanced nervously toward Dr. Forsyth, as though seeking his counsel, but the physician remained silent, his face unreadable. He was standing near the door, his hands clasped behind his back, staring at the floor with an almost eerie detachment. Lady Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper when she spoke again. "In the library. But it's not as it seems, Mr. Holmes. It wasn't supposed to happen this way." Holmes gave a curt nod, signalling for Lady Eleanor to lead the way. He had no interest in further explanations at this moment. What he needed now were facts, concrete evidence that could illuminate the truth hidden behind her fractured words. The house seemed to grow quieter with every step they took, the muffled sound of their footsteps, the only noise that broke the stillness. Holmes's mind was already processing the scene ahead, already pulling at the threads of the puzzle that had been presented to him. Lord Ashford was dead, and yet there were so many questions left unanswered. They arrived at the library, a room that, like the study, was steeped in darkness, save for the faint glow of the firelight creeping in through the narrow windows. The atmosphere in the room was heavy, laden with the smell of old paper and dust, and the air itself seemed thick, suffocating. Holmes's sharp eyes swept over the room, noting the subtle details. The large, grand bookshelves, the sprawling rugs that covered most of the floor, the comfortable chairs set before the fireplace. It seemed as though nothing was out of place, save for the large, ornate chair in the centre of the room, which was now occupied by a still figure draped in a heavy black cloth. "Is that him?" Holmes asked, though he knew the answer before it was spoken. There was an undeniable finality to the way the body was arranged. Lady Eleanor nodded, her expression hollow. "Yes. I don't understand how it happened." Her voice broke with the last word, and Holmes could see her hands trembling in the dim light. Holmes approached the body slowly, each step deliberate. He could sense the weight of the room pressing against him, each inch forward feeling like it was drawing him deeper into the mystery. As he stood over the body, he took in every detail. The heavy cloth that covered Lord Ashford's form, the stillness that lingered around the body. Nothing about the scene felt right, and Holmes knew that the answers he sought were hidden beneath the surface of this carefully crafted illusion. He reached down and gently lifted the cloth from the body. The sight that met him was chilling. Lord Ashford's face was pale, his features slack, his eyes wide open in a silent expression of shock. His body appeared undisturbed, save for the faintest trace of blood at the corner of his mouth. Holmes knelt down, inspecting the body more closely. There was no sign of a struggle, no obvious wounds. Yet the blood, a small but telling stain at the corner of his mouth, was enough to suggest something far more sinister. The cause of death wasn't immediately apparent, but Holmes knew that time would reveal its secrets. Lady Eleanor remained behind him, her hands pressed against her chest, as though she were holding herself together by sheer force of will. She didn't speak, but Holmes could feel her eyes on him, waiting for him to confirm the truth that they both already knew. Holmes stood, his mind already racing with possibilities. "This was no accident," he murmured. His voice was calm, but his mind was already working through the implications of what he was seeing. Dr. Forsyth had stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he observed the body. "You're right," he said, his voice flat. "But there's no sign of trauma. No wounds to speak of." Holmes turned his gaze toward the physician, his sharp eyes scrutinizing every movement. "No, there isn't. But that doesn't rule out the possibility of poisoning, does it?" Dr. Forsyth stiffened at the suggestion, his jaw tightening. "Poisoning?" he echoed, a note of disbelief creeping into his tone. "That's a rather drastic conclusion, Mr. Holmes. We should consider all possibilities before jumping to such an accusation." Holmes locked eyes with Dr. Forsyth, his expression unreadable. "It's not an accusation, Doctor. It's an observation. And in my experience, a man of Lord Ashford's position wouldn't simply die of natural causes without warning, especially given the circumstances surrounding his health of late. It's a possibility we cannot ignore." Lady Eleanor's breath caught at Holmes's words, her face pale beneath the soft glow of the firelight. "But how would anyone even get close enough to him?" she asked, her voice shaky with fear. "He's always surrounded by people." Holmes paused, his gaze lingering on the lifeless body before him. His mind was already piecing together the events, the connections forming with each new clue that emerged. "A poisoned drink, perhaps," he suggested, "something that might have been slipped into his evening glass, undetected." Lady Eleanor paled even further at the thought. "No, it couldn't be." Holmes turned to her, his expression softening for the first time since the investigation had begun. "Lady Eleanor," he said gently, "I'm afraid that the truth of what happened here tonight may be far darker than any of us realize." The room was suffused with a palpable silence as Holmes stood over Lord Ashford's body, his mind unravelling the thread of the crime that had been so carefully concealed. The flickering fire in the hearth cast deep shadows across the walls, its warmth doing little to counter the chill that had settled into the room. Lady Eleanor stood beside him, her posture stiff with anxiety, her eyes darting to the body, and then away as if unwilling to confront the grim reality of the situation. Dr. Forsyth lingered near the door, his eyes clouded with concern, though he made no move to approach the scene. Holmes could sense the weight of their collective guilt, their reluctance to speak openly. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut through, yet it was as if each individual were caught in their own web of uncertainty. The questions were many, but the answers remained elusive. "Lady Eleanor," Holmes began, his voice low but firm, "you mentioned earlier that things were not as they seemed. Now would be the time to elaborate." She looked at him, her lips pressing together in a tight line. The vulnerability in her eyes was raw, but there was also a flicker of something darker. Fear. Guilt. Perhaps both. She hesitated, her gaze shifting between Holmes and the body. The words seemed to catch in her throat before finally escaping. "There was a situation," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lord Ashford had enemies, Mr. Holmes. He was involved in matters that were far beyond our understanding. There were debts, and not just financial ones." Holmes tilted his head slightly, absorbing the information. "Enemies," he repeated, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken thoughts. "Did these enemies have names? Who stood to gain from his death?" Lady Eleanor's eyes flickered toward Dr. Forsyth, who had remained silent thus far, but there was no reassurance in his gaze. His eyes were hard, unreadable, though his stance had subtly shifted, as though the weight of her words had disturbed him. "There were rumours," Lady Eleanor continued, her voice trembling, "of a business deal gone wrong. Lord Ashford had been involved with men whose reputations were questionable at best. I know he was trying to get out of it, trying to clean up his affairs." Holmes took a step closer to her, his sharp gaze never leaving her face. "Who are these men?" he pressed. "Who were his partners?" Her eyes filled with uncertainty, and for the first time, she looked vulnerable, truly vulnerable. "I can't say for sure," she murmured, looking down at her hands. "But I know he was being blackmailed. We both knew, but there was nothing we could do." The air seemed to grow heavier with her admission, and Holmes allowed the silence to settle before responding. "You mentioned debts, financial, yes, but also personal. What were these debts? Who was he in conflict with?" Holmes asked again, his tone gentle yet insistent, as if coaxing the truth from her. Lady Eleanor swallowed hard before answering. I believe it was a man named Horace Wills. He was a businessman, a partner in Lord Ashford's ventures. But they fell out. There was a scandal, something to do with a lost shipment. Lord Ashford didn't speak of it often, but it was clear that it had ruined them both. Wills was a man who didn't forgive. Dr. Forsyth had begun to shift uncomfortably, his posture stiffening. "Lady Eleanor," he interjected, his voice laced with an edge of authority, "I think we've spoken enough for now. It's not wise to speak of such matters so openly. There's no telling what damage we could cause." Holmes turned to Dr. Forsyth, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly. "Damage?" he echoed. "The damage has already been done, Doctor. Lord Ashford is dead, and it is only a matter of time before the truth comes to light. If you have anything to contribute, now would be the time to do so." The physician hesitated, his face betraying the flicker of something Holmes could not quite read. The atmosphere in the room shifted again, the unease in the air growing thicker, as though something was about to break. "Of course," Dr. Forsyth finally said, his voice colder now. "But we must be careful. The repercussions of what you're suggesting could be far-reaching. There are people who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. I caution you, Mr. Holmes, against making accusations without full evidence." Holmes regarded him coolly. "I don't make accusations, Doctor. I seek the truth. And the truth is that Lord Ashford was involved in something far more dangerous than either of you are willing to admit." Lady Eleanor trembled slightly at the words, her eyes flicking toward Dr. Forsyth for reassurance. Holmes noted the subtle dynamic between them, a silent exchange of glances that seemed to speak volumes without words. Whatever Dr. Forsyth knew, he was not willing to share. Not yet, at least. The room fell into silence again, but the tension only seemed to build. Holmes could feel it, the pressure mounting in the air, the sense that everyone in the room was holding something back. They all knew more than they were willing to admit, and Holmes intended to uncover it all. Finally, breaking the silence, Holmes spoke again. "I would like to speak with the staff. Mrs. White, the housekeeper. She may know something more about Lord Ashford's activities. Perhaps she saw something that has been overlooked." Lady Eleanor's expression darkened at the mention of the housekeeper. "Mrs. White is loyal," she said stiffly. "She has served this house for years." Holmes met her gaze, his expression unchanged. "Loyalty does not always equate to truth, Lady Eleanor," he replied, his voice soft but unwavering. The conversation turned to practicalities, the need for further investigation pressing against the walls of the room like a tangible force. Holmes, despite his calm demeanour, could feel the storm that was brewing just beneath the surface. The house was filled with secrets, and it would take all of his skill to pry them out, one piece at a time. As he prepared to leave the library and seek out the housekeeper, Holmes could feel the tension following him, the quiet anticipation hanging in the air. This was only the beginning. The house felt different now. The steady hum of conversation and the warmth of the fire were replaced by a tense, almost suffocating stillness. As Holmes made his way through the narrow corridors of the manor, he could feel the weight of suspicion hanging in the air, thick and unyielding. Each step seemed to carry him closer to the truth, yet the answers remained just out of reach, hidden beneath layers of lies and half-truths. Lady Eleanor had been quiet since their exchange in the library, her words growing more guarded with each passing moment. She had grown distant, her once fluid manner of speech now stiff and measured, as though she were carefully choosing each word. Holmes had noticed her growing unease as the investigation deepened, her reluctance to speak, her nervous glances toward Dr. Forsyth, and the subtle tension between them. It was clear that there was more to this than either of them had let on. Holmes arrived at the servants' quarters and paused at the door, his hand resting lightly on the brass handle. Mrs. White had been the one to answer the door earlier when Holmes first arrived at the manor. Her expression had been kind but distant, a woman accustomed to being in the background, but something about her manner had unsettled him. She had seemed eager, too eager to please, and the way she avoided direct eye contact had struck Holmes as suspicious. He opened the door and stepped inside. The room was small, sparsely furnished, with only a narrow bed and a wooden chest against one wall. The air was heavy with the scent of lavender and dust, the windows barely allowing any light to seep through the curtains. It felt as though time had stood still here, just as it had in the rest of the house. The room was immaculately clean, but there was something unnatural about its orderliness, as though it had been tidied too thoroughly, too meticulously. Mrs. White sat by the window, her hands folded in her lap, her back stiff with formality. She turned her head slightly as Holmes entered, her eyes flicking briefly to his before returning to the empty space before her. She was an older woman, her features sharp with age, though her expression was unreadable. "Mrs. White," Holmes began, his voice measured but carrying an unmistakable authority. "I trust you are well?" She looked at him for a moment before nodding curtly. "I'm well enough, Mr. Holmes," she replied, her voice soft but clear. "What can I do for you?" Holmes studied her for a moment longer, taking in her tightly clasped hands and the faint tremor that ran through her fingers. She was composed, yes, but her calm exterior did nothing to mask the unease that lingered just beneath the surface. He had no intention of drawing the answers from her too quickly. He knew that he needed to be patient. After all, every clue had its own rhythm, its own moment of revelation. "I understand you've been in Lord Ashford's service for many years," Holmes continued, his tone casual yet probing. "You must know him quite well." Mrs. White's expression faltered for a brief second, a flicker of something hidden flashing across her face. She took a deep breath before responding, her voice even quieter now. "I've been here long enough to know my place, Mr. Holmes," she said, the words guarded but heavy with the weight of something unsaid. Holmes stepped closer, his sharp eyes never leaving her face. "And your place, Mrs. White, does it allow you to witness things? Things that others might not see?" She blinked, her gaze shifting to the floor, her lips pressed together as though to keep something in, something that might slip out if she wasn't careful. Holmes waited, allowing the silence to stretch out between them, feeling the tension build. "You must know that Lord Ashford was a man of many interests," Holmes said after a moment, his voice softer now. "And those interests often brought him into contact with people who were not always trustworthy. What can you tell me about these people, Mrs. White? Did you ever see anything unusual? Any signs of trouble?" Mrs. White's hands tightened in her lap, her knuckles white against the dark fabric of her skirt. Her lips trembled, but she said nothing for a long time. Holmes remained silent, knowing that his patience would eventually wear her down. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "There were times, Mr. Holmes, times when Lord Ashford would receive visitors. Visitors who weren't invited, you understand? They would come in the dead of night, knocking quietly on the back door, so no one would see them. He would meet with them in his study, and I would be told to leave the house for the evening." Holmes's interest piqued. "And these visitors, who were they? What did you see?" Mrs. White shook her head, her eyes downcast. "I don't know their names, but I know the way they looked. They were rough men, not like the others Lord Ashford associated with. Their clothes were always dark, and their eyes, they had a coldness to them. I tried not to listen, but sometimes I could hear their voices through the door." Holmes leaned in slightly, his voice lowering. "And what did you hear, Mrs. White? What did they say?" For a moment she said nothing. The room seemed to close in around them, the silence stretching out, thick with the weight of unspoken words. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and regret. "I heard talk of money," she said quietly. "Lord Ashford owed them. He owed them a great deal, more than he could repay. They threatened him, Mr. Holmes. They threatened his life if he didn't make good on the debt." Holmes stood silently for a moment, letting her words sink in. There it was, the first real lead. Lord Ashford's debts, not just to Wills, but to others. Others who were not bound by the same codes of civility. It was becoming clear that Lord Ashford's financial troubles ran deeper than anyone had imagined. "And did you ever hear Lord Ashford mention these men? Did he ever speak of them to anyone else?" Holmes asked. Mrs. White shook her head, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and guilt. "No, Mr. Holmes. He was careful. He never spoke of them, not to anyone. But I could see the change in him. After each visit, he would look more haggard, more broken. I think he knew they would come for him one day." Holmes nodded slowly, piecing the information together. The debts, the mysterious visitors, and now the fear that had gripped Lord Ashford in the final days of his life. But there was something else, something more troubling. The visitations, the secret meetings, all pointed to a growing sense of danger surrounding Lord Ashford's every move. Someone had been watching. Someone had been waiting for the right moment to strike. "I appreciate your honesty, Mrs. White," Holmes said, his voice gentle yet firm. "You've given me much to consider, and I would suggest that you remain vigilant. There is much more at play here than you may realize." Her gaze flicked toward him, her eyes haunted. "I only wanted to protect him," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't want anything to happen to him." Holmes paused for a moment, studying her face, the sorrow that seemed to permeate her every word. He could see that Mrs. White, despite her years of service, had been caught in a situation much larger than she could have ever anticipated. "There's no need to protect him any longer, Mrs. White," Holmes said softly, his eyes narrowing as the final pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. "Not from me." The night had fallen heavier than before, the fog pressing against the windows of the library like a living thing, eager to invade the warmth of the room. Sherlock Holmes sat by the hearth, his long fingers steepled together in contemplation, the flickering fire casting shadows on his sharp features. Lady Eleanor had long since retired to her quarters, and Dr. Forsyth had taken his leave, though Holmes was not certain whether the physician had departed from the house or merely gone to brood in some other dark corner. Both men had been on edge all evening, but Holmes had learned to trust in the silence that followed a storm. It was always in the quiet that the most delicate truths could be found. Holmes sat alone in the study, his mind a maze of connections and contradictions. The puzzle was there, laid out before him like a tapestry woven from the threads of the past. Lord Ashford's debts, the mysterious visitors, the whispered threats of violence. It all pointed in one direction, but the final answer still eluded him. He needed to draw the threads tighter, to weave them into something more concrete. His eyes flitted over the various items on the desk, each piece a clue in its own right. The papers, hastily pushed to the side, the bottle of whiskey, its contents nearly gone, the faint but undeniable smell of something metallic. And there, buried beneath the clutter, was the smallest of details, almost hidden, a broken glass. It was no more than a fragment, caught between a stack of papers, but it spoke volumes. The shape of the shard, the way it had been discarded, seemed deliberate. No accident. Holmes leaned forward, examining the glass shard more closely. The edges were jagged, its surface worn down from contact with the floor, but it was the imprint of fingerprints that caught his attention. They were faint, nearly imperceptible, but they were there. A smudge of something that had been touched with carelessness, yet had been left in plain sight, as though daring him to find it. He straightened, a sense of clarity sweeping over him. His mind moved quickly now, running through the events in rapid succession. Lord Ashford's death. No signs of a struggle, no open wounds, yet the faint trace of blood at his lips. A sign that something had entered his body, something that shouldn't have. Poison. Yes, that was the most likely cause. But it wasn't just any poison. It was something subtle, something that would leave little trace. His eyes shifted to the room's other occupants, both present and absent, the players in this dangerous game. Lady Eleanor's careful words, the way she had hesitated before mentioning Lord Ashford's enemies, spoke of a woman who had been caught between loyalty and fear. She was hiding something, that much was clear. But what? And Dr. Forsyth, the ever-calm physician, there was something about him, something too practiced in his calmness, a quiet desperation to control the narrative. Could he have been involved? Holmes rose to his feet, walking toward the window. The view outside was obscured by the dense fog, the manor almost indistinguishable from the mist that enveloped it. It was the perfect setting for a crime, a place where secrets could be buried and forgotten, where the past could be hidden from prying eyes. He turned back to the desk, his mind still working, the pieces of the puzzle coming together one by one. There was something more to the story than the debts, more than the poison. Something was off about the entire situation, the timing of Lord Ashford's death, the way it had been staged, the careful placement of clues. Whoever had orchestrated this had thought of everything, including the way the story would unfold. Holmes's mind snapped back to Mrs. White's confession, the mention of Lord Ashford's meeting with men who had come to collect on a debt. Those men, the rough visitors who had arrived in the dead of night. What if they weren't the only ones involved? What if someone closer to Lord Ashford had orchestrated his downfall, using the debt as a cover, manipulating events from behind the scenes? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door creaking open. Lady Eleanor appeared in the doorway, her face drawn and pale, the weight of the night's revelations heavy on her shoulders. She had come back to speak with him, though Holmes knew it wasn't just a matter of courtesy. She wanted answers, just as much as he did. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice trembling, as though she had only just found the courage to speak. "About the visitors, the men who came to the house." Holmes turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Go on," he said quietly, his voice encouraging but firm. Lady Eleanor hesitated, her eyes flicking to the shadows that danced along the walls before settling on Holmes. "I never told you everything," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never told you about Horace Wills, the man who was behind it all." Holmes's brow furrowed. "Wills," he repeated, his mind racing. "What do you know about him?" Lady Eleanor swallowed hard, her hands trembling at her sides. He wasn't just a business partner. He was more. He was a man who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. And when he came to collect, he didn't just want money. He wanted something far more valuable. Holmes moved closer, his voice steady but insistent. "And what was that, Lady Eleanor?" She took a deep breath, steadying herself before she spoke. "Lord Ashford's position, his influence. Wills wanted to take control of everything, his estate, his name, his reputation. He saw Lord Ashford as an obstacle, something to be removed, and that's what he did." The pieces were beginning to fall into place, their sharp edges aligning perfectly. Lord Ashford had been no simple victim of financial ruin. He had been caught in a web of greed and power, a pawn in a much larger game. Wills had used his debts as a cover, manipulating the situation to his advantage, orchestrating the death with calculated precision. But there was still something missing, something that didn't quite add up. "Did Wills act alone?" Holmes asked, his voice quiet but commanding. "Was there anyone else involved?" Lady Eleanor's eyes dropped to the floor, her face flushed with shame. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know. But I know that when he came to see Lord Ashford, he wasn't alone. There were others." Holmes nodded, his mind already turning over the new information. The truth was closer now, but it still eluded him, dancing just out of reach. He needed to act quickly before the web of lies grew even more tangled. Holmes looked up at Lady Eleanor, his gaze piercing through the veil of uncertainty that clouded her expression. "You've done well, Lady Eleanor," he said softly, his voice carrying a hint of something warmer. "But the truth must be uncovered, no matter the cost." The grand hall was still. Not even the faintest sound of the wind outside penetrated the heavy silence. The only movement was the flickering shadows cast by the firelight, their restless dance mirrored in the tense expressions of the gathered guests. Holmes stood at the centre of the room, his sharp eyes scanning the faces before him. Lady Eleanor sat at the far end, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her expression a mixture of resignation and anticipation. Dr. Forsyth lingered near the window, his eyes avoiding Holmes as if afraid to face the detective's gaze. Holmes's thoughts were a whirlwind, every piece of the puzzle finally falling into place. He had been patient, allowing the investigation to unfold at its own pace, but now the moment had come. The truth could no longer be ignored, no longer kept hidden behind carefully constructed lies. The game had reached its end. Holmes cleared his throat, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, I believe we have arrived at the moment where the truth must be revealed." Dr. Forsyth shifted uneasily, his fingers tightening against the wooden arm of the chair as though bracing for impact. Lady Eleanor remained still, her gaze fixed on Holmes, her face pale beneath the soft glow of the fire. She had long since abandoned her earlier composure, the weight of her guilt now too heavy to bear. Holmes took a step forward, his eyes flicking over the room one last time before locking onto Dr. Forsyth. "I trust you're aware, Doctor, that the circumstances surrounding Lord Ashford's death have been less than transparent." Dr. Forsyth swallowed, his throat working as if struggling to maintain control. "I don't know what you mean, Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice steady, but laced with a hint of unease. "The cause of death is obvious. Poison, as you yourself suggested." Holmes raised a brow. "Ah, yes, poison. But you see, Doctor, the method of poisoning was far more intricate than you might have anticipated." He glanced at Lady Eleanor, who was now visibly trembling, her hands twisting in her lap. "And the man behind it all, I believe, was someone who knew far too much about Lord Ashford's financial troubles. A man who had motives far beyond mere money." Dr. Forsyth's jaw clenched. His eyes flickered briefly toward Lady Eleanor before he straightened, his posture rigid. "Mr. Holmes, I do not understand where you're going with this. You've accused me. You've accused all of us. And yet, there's no evidence to substantiate your claims." Holmes's lips curled into a thin, almost imperceptible smile. "No evidence?" "Dr. Forsyth, the evidence has been staring you in the face the entire time. The subtlety of your actions, the way you covered up the true cause of death, the manner in which you manipulated the scene. It's all too neat, too perfectly staged." The physician remained silent, but his eyes darted nervously around the room, as though searching for an escape from Holmes's scrutiny. The pressure was mounting, the walls of suspicion closing in on him. Lady Eleanor's voice broke through the tension, shaky but determined. "You're wrong, Mr. Holmes. It was Horace Wills, not Dr. Forsyth. He was the one who—" Her voice trailed off, her words lost in the weight of the revelation she was about to make. "He was the one who wanted Ashford dead. He threatened him. You don't understand. He made it clear that if Ashford didn't step aside, he would take everything." Holmes nodded, his eyes not leaving Dr. Forsyth's face. "And you, Doctor, were complicit in all of it. You knew about Wills. You knew about the debts, about the pressures Lord Ashford was under. And when the opportunity presented itself, you decided to take matters into your own hands. It was a simple matter for you to poison Lord Ashford, to make it look like an accident. After all, you were the one closest to him, the one trusted with his health." Dr. Forsyth's face hardened, his expression narrowing into something dangerously close to fury. "You have no right to accuse me of such things," he spat, his voice rising. "I've spent my entire career helping people, saving lives. You think I would kill a man for money? For power? You're mistaken, Holmes." Holmes's gaze never wavered. "Your profession gives you access, Doctor. It grants you the perfect cover to conceal your true intentions. You were the one who had the means to administer the poison undetected, to ensure that Lord Ashford's death appeared natural. It's all too perfect, isn't it? Your calm demeanour, your apparent detachment from the chaos around you. But underneath that, you knew what you were doing. You knew exactly what you were getting yourself into." Dr. Forsyth took a step back, his face pale, his mouth working as if to find the right words. But nothing came. It was as if Holmes had stripped away the last of his defences, leaving nothing but the bitter truth standing in the light. "And what of Lady Eleanor?" Holmes continued, his tone shifting as he turned his attention to her. "What part did you play in all of this, my lady?" Lady Eleanor's face flushed with a mixture of guilt and shame. Her hands were trembling now, the delicate lace of her gloves betraying her anxiety. I didn't know what to do, she whispered. I didn't know how to stop it. Wills had him trapped and I couldn't bear to see my husband suffer. So I did what I thought was best. I helped cover it up, to protect him. Holmes nodded, his eyes never leaving her face. You see, Lady Eleanor, it was never just about the money. It was about control. Wills wanted power over Lord Ashford, and you, caught between loyalty to your husband and your own fear of losing everything, chose to help him maintain that control. You helped him orchestrate the perfect murder. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of Holmes's words sinking in, filling the space with a suffocating tension. Holmes's eyes flickered back to Dr. Forsyth. But your part in this, Doctor, was not as simple as you'd hoped it would be. Wills may have been the catalyst, but it was you who pulled the trigger. It was you who made sure that no one would suspect anything. Dr. Forsyth's lips trembled, his composure cracking beneath the weight of the truth. You're wrong, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I never meant for it to go this far, but it had to be done. Ashford was going to ruin us all. Holmes took a step back, allowing the full gravity of the confession to hang in the air. His voice, when it came, was quiet but firm. And so, you took matters into your own hands. You made sure that Lord Ashford would never have the chance to turn things around. You thought you could control it all, but you miscalculated. He paused, his sharp eyes cutting through the tense atmosphere, seeing everything with unnerving clarity. The truth always has a way of revealing itself, no matter how well it is concealed. The fire had long since died down, its once bright flames now reduced to little more than smouldering embers. The room was cold, the air heavy with the weight of what had just been revealed. Holmes stood before the dying hearth, his figure silhouetted against the dim light. His sharp eyes, usually so piercing, were now clouded with the quiet satisfaction of a case solved, though there was no triumph in his demeanour. Only the silent acknowledgement that the truth, while necessary, always came at a cost. Lady Eleanor had been escorted from the room, her fragile form disappearing into the shadows of the manor. She had said little since the confrontation, her eyes hollow with guilt, the weight of her betrayal bearing down upon her. Dr. Forsyth, too, had been taken away, his once composed manner now shattered by the force of his actions being laid bare. They would both face the consequences of their choices, but there was no joy in that for Holmes. Only a quiet understanding that justice had been done, but at a great personal price. The manor, once full of the rustling sounds of life, now seemed to be holding its breath. The servants had been dismissed, their movements slow, their faces etched with the kind of quiet understanding that comes with being in the presence of a storm that has passed, but leaves its mark behind. The house itself felt colder now, its walls still and unforgiving, as if it had grown tired of holding its secrets. Holmes turned from the fireplace, his mind already turning over the events that had transpired. The case was over, but the echoes of it would linger. In the distance he could hear the sound of carriage wheels, a reminder that life would move on, even if the people in it never would. Holmes had seen it before. People would adapt, move on, put the past behind them. But the shadows of what had happened would follow them, always. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts, and he turned to find Inspector Lestrade standing in the doorway, his face as impassive as ever, but his eyes betraying a flicker of something more. Perhaps respect, or maybe just a begrudging acknowledgement of Holmes's unparalleled skill. Holmes, Lestrade said quietly, stepping into the room. The suspects have been taken into custody. They'll stand trial for what they've done. Holmes nodded, his gaze shifting back to the embers. I've no doubt they'll receive the justice they deserve. But as always, it's not the punishment that interests me. It's the reasons behind the actions, the motives that drive people to do the unthinkable. Lestrade sighed, his shoulders heavy with the weight of their shared work. You're right about that. But sometimes, Holmes, it's just the end result that matters. The law can only do so much, and after that, it's up to the courts to decide what happens next. Holmes didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped toward the window, pulling the curtain aside to glance out into the fog-choked night. The city was a blur, a mix of shapes and shadows, but beneath it all, Holmes knew the world would continue. The same people who had conspired, who had lied and betrayed one another, would return to their lives, their fortunes no doubt tainted, but their futures still intact. The thought was sobering. "It's strange," Holmes said after a long pause, his voice distant. "We spend so much time chasing the truth, unraveling the lies people tell. But in the end, it's not the truth that changes anything. It's how it is accepted, how it is dealt with. Some people learn from it, others bury it, hoping that the weight of it won't crush them." Lestrade leaned against the doorframe, watching Holmes closely. "You're a hard man to understand, Holmes. You catch the criminals, you reveal the lies, but you never seem satisfied with just the result. You're always searching for something more." Holmes turned back toward him, his face softening slightly, though his expression remained unreadable. "Perhaps I am, but that doesn't mean I don't know when a case is closed. I've gathered the pieces, laid out the truth, and in the end, that is all that matters. The rest is beyond me." There was a moment of quiet between them, the air thick with an unspoken understanding. The case was done, and yet, in some ways, it felt as though it had only just begun. The complexities of human nature, the tangled webs people wove, were mysteries that could never be fully solved, only understood in pieces. Lestrade sighed and straightened up, taking a step toward the door. "Well, I'll leave you to your thoughts, Holmes. You've earned the peace of mind, even if it's only for a short while." Holmes didn't answer immediately, his gaze still fixed on the window, lost in his own reflections. The detective knew that this case, like so many others, would fade into the background of his mind, pushed aside by the next mystery, the next puzzle that would demand his attention. But something about this one, something about the way it had played out, left a lingering taste of bitterness. It wasn't the poison, or the betrayal, or even the deaths that haunted him. It was the understanding that the world would continue, that the players would move on, and the cycle would repeat. But as the fog swallowed the streets outside, as the shadows grew longer and the night deepened, Holmes felt a fleeting moment of peace. The answers had been found, the story told, and for now at least, the mystery had come to an end.